Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kira Cooper, and I'm co-president of the Environmental Studies Association of Canada. Today, I have the great privilege of welcoming Zach Weismann, the founder of The Impactful, into a conversation around redefining togetherness through social impact business models. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you, Kira. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. So, for our audience here today, wondering if you could give us a bit, take us on the journey of The Impactful, how you got there, and also just open a conversation around what it means to do impactful business in these hyper normal times.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Kira. Yeah, so I'm Zach Weismann. I've been in the climate sustainability space for pretty much my entire career, so about 15 or so years. 6 years ago, we founded The Impactful. Best way to describe The Impactful is a social impact consultancy with a community. So we have 200 members around the world. These members are freelancers, consultants, solopreneurs, enter another buzzword, but it's essentially people who in various shapes, either through their full-time work, contract work, or through their own companies, have dedicated their careers to social impact. And then we are able to team up and offer a whole host of services to organizations, both big corporates to small startups and NGOs. And those services are branding, marketing, design, as well as some sort of subject specialty services in the climate sustainability space. How I got into that space, which I think is very much aligned with the conversation around togetherness and different business models and sort of navigating these challenging times we're in is, kind of traditional, maybe impact career. I started in nonprofits and NGOs. I worked at a global NGO. I worked at one of the world's largest private family foundations. And then I transitioned into, not necessarily intentionally at the time, into more of the social impact for-profit space. And what I really appreciated was having the background, I had seen how NGOs worked from the inside out. I had seen how foundations worked from the inside out, and now was transitioning into social impact for-profit space, which I know we'll dive into. And really going through that, it led to working with large corporations. Working with those large corporations obviously brought a whole host of creative services. So even if you're working with Coca-Cola or IKEA on sustainability, you tend to have creative agencies, marketing, PR, comms, legal, all involved. And so that exposed me to kind of the creative tangential space. Went and did that, worked at some creative agencies that focus on social impact. And then, as we'll dive into, decided to start my own. So that's kind of been the journey to date.
Great, thank you. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what social impact actually means. And I know people are quite often looking for work in the environmental space that has a positive impact. One of the challenges being if you're not working for an NGO or you're not working for government or not working for academia, where are these spaces? And I know a lot of people, I see it especially in my students, want to avoid working in private sector because private sector has a really bad name when it comes to the environment. But how can we change the way that we're engaging with the private sector? How can we kind of change our entire model around doing business that is more aligned with impact long term?
It's a great question, Kira. And I think there's a couple aspects that sort of I think we see today and then also has happened over the course of my career. Yeah, 15, 20 years ago when I was graduating university, it was kind of you went to work for a nonprofit. I studied economics and accounting and finance, and I was never told that you could apply that to environmental services, which is we know now is not true. So, it's a little bit of understanding how your school, your degree, your education can be applied. And then also we've seen rapid involvement in all sorts of business models. So again, yeah, 15, 20 years ago, traditional to go to an NGO. At that time for me in my career, I looked at a lot of organizations like World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International. And most everyone who was younger in their career worked there had some field experience. And that meant, working in a developing country, working at a wildlife sanctuary, working on a farm. I mean, literally like hands in dirt field experience. And I said, okay, I think I need some of that. So I left my job and I moved to South America to volunteer with an NGO for 6 or 8 months. And part of that was solely driven by I saw that a lot of people in that space at the NGOs had this type of experience. And I said, well, I think that's kind of what the market is telling me I need. At the same time, over these last 15, 20 years, obviously so much has changed, good and bad. But one of the things that we typically have seen in the environmental climate space is the equating the climate crisis in dollars and cents. And that has its obvious pros and cons. But one thing was, you saw things like research being done on the how much a wild elephant is worth alive to a Nigerian community as opposed to killed and poached for product. And that kind of shifted. I was actually in wildlife conservation when this stuff kind of came out. You saw putting dollars and cents, equating the environment, natural resources to GDP. And that was a real effort from the environmental community to try to speak business. Like, okay, we can tug on the emotional heartstrings, but how do we get corporations, governments, individuals to see that this has really, intangible value? And so you saw things like the coral reef is worth $300 trillion. Like, okay, that's hard to quantify, but it shifted the conversation and the value so that I think that was kind of early incubating of social enterprises. One of the social enterprises that came out of this was in the early days was Tom's Shoes that maybe students now aren't that familiar with, but maybe when you and I were students around then, it was kind of a big deal from the sense of Tom's Shoes, again, pros and cons to that business model. But if someone's not familiar, they kind of were the originators of this one for one model. If someone in a developing country buys a pair of shoes, they donated a pair of shoes to someone in need in developing countries. And I think what that did was, yes, there's criticisms to that sort of model, but it opened the floodgates or it changed people's perceptions to, oh, you can have a business for good. You can make money and also try to do some good work. You could look at your business model. You could look at your funding structure. You could look at what you sell, how you sell it. And ultimately, Tom's Shoes was a profitable business and they were donating a lot of shoes. And they did that in sunglasses and they performed, worked with Doctors Without Borders and did eye surgery. So that was an early one that I think kind of took this changing landscape of philanthropy and businesses and showed you these new business models. And through that, we've seen over the years, of course, immersion of B Corp, and corporations obtaining a certification that says they meet certain levels of criteria. I've seen that in many whole hosts. And then also with the rise of the startup ecosystem and the venture capital funding, climate, sustainability, venture capital, and startups being, very quite popular over the last couple of years. So, there's certain norms that have been bucked and have been stereotypes that maybe over time have been, sort of demystified to say, okay, there are models. Are there corporations doing a lot of bad? Absolutely. Are there nonprofits that probably could do better or universities that maybe could do better? Of course. So I think there's a little bit of everything has to take it with a grain of salt. But the early shift was getting the climate movement, the environmental movement to speak the language of business, to help businesses also see that it's not always an or conversation. It wasn't caring for the planet or profit. It was actually could be both. You could do both. You could have, if you cleaned up your supply chain, if you reduced waste, if you reduce the amount of pollution, you could actually also be more profitable. Or if Tom's Shoes showed you that you could, really take a chunk out of your profit and be more profitable in the long run. So happy to go into more detail, but I think that's some of the evolution over the space that has said, open the pathways for young learners to apply their knowledge in a whole host of industries.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's super useful. I think back to Tom's Shoes. Wow, we're getting old. I think the more common brand that stands out now is really like Patagonia. I see that being more
More
fashion.
relevant. Thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah.
aging me. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, and I think to our students or the younger people watching this who are interested in still positively contributing through their career, maybe new graduates, for example, that are looking for ways to support the environment and to support companies, for example, that are on their environmental journey. So I'm curious if you could speak a bit to what impact matters, and also maybe we could follow that up with something along the lines of how bringing people together who are working on climate change can actually be a system amplifier for good. And so many people are, in fact, leaving the climate space because they are burning out or feeling isolated and lonely. And perhaps what an alternative model could be mutually beneficial for those working in the climate space as well as climate progress, broadly progress across sectors as well. So anything along that that speaks to you would be great.
Yeah, I think the remind me the first part of your question was about essentially what pathways there are to. I missed the first part.
Sure, yeah. If you could just speak to that and how you're measuring impact, for
Yeah,
example, and what that constitutes in your work.
yeah. So it's kind of interesting because I think over time for those in the impactful, myself, I'm sure perhaps even some of this resonates with you or anyone who's been in the space, whether it's academia, for profit, in the public private sectors, is we forget that at a big picture level, the climate movement, climate change, our knowledge, our understanding science is so rapidly changing. Even like similar to health, right? We make new discoveries, we learn new things. 5, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about carbon off or carbon removal and storage, and now it became, almost out of nowhere, it became a huge industry that people were putting some significant capital behind. Again, it has an asterisk with it as not being a silver bullet, but that is maybe a recent example of something that didn't even exist, or folks weren't even talking about, or we didn't have that technology or that capabilities just a few years ago, and it is essentially given rise to an entire industry. So sometimes the movement itself can dictate where an individual feels impactful or feels like they're excuse me, maybe having an impact because things change, right? It could be based off an individual's experiences. Maybe somebody is feeling called to wildlife conservation or has always cared about biology. And so that is how one sort of it tugs on the heartstrings in terms of how an individual feels impactful. For me, for a personal example, is always documentaries. If I watched The Cove, well, again, I'm going to just date myself, but if Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. I mean, my octopus teacher, which is recent, I cry. I cry like you don't think a grown man would cry during some of those movies, and that because that is, I feel that emotional connection. I feel that heartbreak to some of these stories and the natural world, and that's always been my pull. And so it's like, oh, where and how could I do this? Where or how could I feel like I'm having personal impact? So sometimes that's driven by that. The space itself changes and evolves. We learn new things, new disasters, new crises pop up, and that tugs on people's heartstrings in different ways, and thus also usually leads to business responses, government, or research being done. So you have sort of this natural evolution of how one individually defines impact, and then thus where and how can you work in some of those spaces. Then I think once you find yourself, I think as many know, just these days getting a job and navigating the economy is challenging enough. Once you identify a space that is of interest, you get a job, you get an internship, you feel like you're moving in that direction, then you open the next level of challenges in towards essentially these are big global issues, right? And obviously, much of your work and research is addressing as well. And so you always have this tension between the individual and these big issues, right? You could have an amazing day, feel like you really solved some problem, and then you go home and you open up the news and it's just another wildfire, another disaster, another wildfire. And so there's always this tension that I don't think ever goes away, which leads to, I think, the second part of your question, all the more reason for connection and all the more reason for some new ways of being together, business models, collaboration that helps address that kind of inner turmoil that inner challenge of balancing. Essentially, am I doing enough? Does whatever I do actually make a difference? And with what's going on in the world, and this sort of also this the pace of information and how we receive it. I will say, without it still surprises me, and I think I feel it as well, is how when you meet someone, when you talk to somebody who's in a space like climate or health or education, I still hear how alone people feel, which is an interesting challenge because, you know, at surface level, there's no shortage of communities, organizations, Slack groups, Facebook groups, community groups, but something's missing. Something doesn't, it still feels isolated. And I think we've tried to have conversations, especially in maybe in the for-profit spaces, is that because this is all still kind of rooted in capitalism? Is that because, we're fighting additional fights and we still have a lot of people out there who kind of seemingly based on their actions or their career choices seem like they don't care, or haven't been able to translate that into noticeable change, not to criticize them. And so you're kind of carrying this weight of operating through the world of, am I the only one who gives a shit about this? And how do you carry that plus do your work plus all the other life obligations, plus navigating that? Generally the climate space is, it doesn't seem to be a battle that we're exactly winning at the moment.
No, I think that's a very valid point. And there's new research that's emerging showing that climate change is a superordinate level of trauma. It's like the trauma of traumas, and it's one we can't get away from. It's on our phone, it's in the news, we see it, we experience it depending on who we are, the body we inhabit, the geography that we call home as well. So it's something that we can't get away from. And also, and that's our research or our job or our career, and we're immersed in it day in and day out. There's no separation from our social life or business life. And seeing a decline, for example, in students enrolling in environmental programs or seeing an exodus of climate workers, it really makes me wonder if we had more opportunities like the Impactful, where we could create more solidarity in these cultures of care within a business model, and how that might support both, again, the inner processes of healing for people and the outer processes of supporting collaborative and generative healing at a planetary level. So I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the experiences you've had through a business model, and how this has been affecting the lives of the people you're collaborating with, both from the workers' perspective and also the organizations that you're working with as well.
Yeah, great question, and very well framed, Kira. I think you made me think of, there is still feels like there's this in the, let's just say in the private sector, or at least in my work, this proverbial, it's still about making money. And I think that's where we either have to you have to either like get over ourselves, or try to fix it, or try to come up with something innovative. Having done, as a student in economics and finance, transitioning into the environmental climate space, I have always found myself in kind of business development partnerships type roles. And I'm still surprised. And I think earlier in my career, it was, being naive was, oh, we're two nonprofits trying to save the elephants, but we're still competing over funding. There's a set pool of money. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Or, oh, that makes sense. Oh, that's why we're not really working together the best we can, right? Oh, I'm a sustainability consultant, right? I still need the number of sustainability consultants, us included, kind of in that category, who are dependent on large for-profit corporations to essentially fund their business models high. And so there is this sort of tension of, what are we making? Who are we selling it to? And how does it matter? Even if it's an NGO, right? Where do we get our money? Obviously, as you and I were talking about before, the funding across the board is being cut for so many programs, which is just a tragedy. But that's not going to, at a basic level, doesn't look like it'll increase collaboration. Now, maybe it might, because almost out of sort of this like desperation kind of aspect that we've seen in businesses and organizations respond to, President Trump at various times in the US, et cetera. But at a basic level, it's not good, right? And it doesn't seem like that often. If everybody's fighting for a client or fighting for funding, doesn't preclude itself to collaboration, usually naturally. So I think what we've seen with the impactful is still this. I don't know if it's a lack of familiarity or defense mechanism or sort of wall put up that you just kind of have to get through. And sometimes that is just by being disarming. Or we'll say things like, as a, let's just say a service provider in the private space, we'll say, oh, no, we're not competing with them. Oh, we have to articulate and get ahead of perceptions of competition or perceptions of challenges that it's like, no, I'm not coming for your money, right? Or, oh, no, you can work with that agency. And so there's a little bit of like malleability, which also I think in an industry level, sort of the climate sustainability movement has done really well, and especially in private, which means I think the thread line here is, we have the data, we have the insights around climate sustainability, how it applies to the bottom line, how it applies to employee retention, how it applies to, community, recruitment, marketing. Consumers want organic, healthy products. You have the data. And so that space has always sort of been malleable and say, okay, business, what are you seemingly caring about? And how can we frame the issue in a way that allows us in to break these walls down so you don't feel so threatened by what we're doing? And you see that tangibly of, maybe Walmart CEO says, we want to be a regenerative company. Well, I interpret that as, okay, that's a good buzzword. Now let's frame the work and the opportunity in that, because that is a CEO of a Fortune 1 company. That's an in to potentially get in to then do the work. And maybe a dovetail, and this is much more your role than mine, is, pitching funding or articulating research in a certain way that leads to hopefully positive outcomes, right? And I think similarly, you see that in the private space of, how do I get in? How do we act as chameleons to really get the companies to just do the good work? And so I think with the impactful and some of these different business models, both for businesses and within our community, says the competition is not bad. You can be complementary, and you can see that you offer something really well. Sometimes you see that articulated as, staying with your strengths. Say, if you're a really good designer, great, do a designer. You don't also need to do social media. Pair up with somebody who does social media. And then once that trust is formed, then usually those walls start to come down and people are much more amenable to collaborating. It's kind of like, I don't know who wrote, Simon Sinek wrote Leaders Eat Last, but it's kind of like, is there enough food for everybody? And sometimes my role has just been, yeah, we're all going to eat. Don't worry about it. And then people are like, okay, well, Zach said we're all going to eat. Now, sometimes you get into tricky situations, but essentially to say, look, I think if we're smart about this, if we collaborate, if we establish trust, and trust is established in all different kinds of ways that we can talk about more, then I think people's willingness to collaborate, willingness to, work together starts to open up. And when you apply that ability to be malleable and kind of meet them where they are, then guards come down as well. And maybe one small example with that, because it also can be shaped by external factors, is, we started the impactful not, maybe a year or two before the pandemic. And I had this concern at the time, how would companies consider the fact something as tangible as that we all had different email addresses? We were working with a company like Google, and it was Zach Weismann at Gmail. It was Kira Cooper at Gmail. We weren't all from one company, one nice packaged brand. So I don't know how they're going to think about this. How do they see us and trust? And once I explain that we vet the network, we have the connective tissue, they're like, okay, that's great. We don't care. We don't care who you are and what you frame. And then you have the pandemic, and obviously what that did with digital remote work and teaming up and collaboration. I think that accelerated a lot of this sort of openness to collaboration out of necessity, right? And we stop paying attention to sort of these some of these like human made structures and just, oh, okay, here's great, here's incredibly bright, she can help us get this done, great, let's do it. So I'll pause there, but that's kind of hopefully some helpful anecdotes.
Yeah, no, it's super helpful. And I like what you're talking about in terms of being a chameleon or almost Trojan horsing. And when you're talking about building those communities of trust, I'm imagining a bunch of different freelancers in a Trojan horse sharing apples. How are we supporting each other there?
We
Um,
do have a physical Trojan horse that we all get in, and we no, I'm just kidding.
yeah, you can
We
just
get
like pedal
wheel.
it from the inside. Oh no, that's
It's
awesome.
remote controlled. It's solar powered.
Oh, now I feel better. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, one thing I just want to pull on one of the threads that you brought up, and just going back to, when I'm teaching or what I see in environmental studies or environmental movements in general, there's often this like vilification of private business, right? Like they're and some for good reason. Like we're seeing this huge backlash in the rollback of sustainability of DEI, and we're seeing these large corporations like Walmart, as you mentioned, rescinding on their pledges and things like that. And I think it just further amplifies like private sector is bad. But I was wondering if you could speak to private sector as being quite a nuanced, and there's more than just the fortune companies, and maybe a bit about like smaller businesses and businesses that are actually looking to engage in a different relationship, both with the people they're working with their clients, and maybe a little leverage room or wiggle space that we don't normally think about when it's supporting transformations in business.
Yeah, great questions, Kara. I think um, a statistic that always has, you know, given me pause in a good way is that I think it's roughly 44, 45% of the US GDP is small businesses. And I think they employ overwhelming, almost roughly maybe 40% of the US workforce. So, I think we also are a little bit in this world right now where there's a lot of the loudest voices get amplified often with social media and things. So we hear about the large corporate initiative. We hear about Tesla. We hear about Google. We don't always hear about, the mom and pop flower shop at the corner that just decided to switch from, flour mulch mix that had chemicals to an organic one. And that's a big deal, but that's not making headline news. So the notion that small businesses around the world still make up a big chunk of GDP and economies gives me some comfort because I think there's still, those are businesses that, are not answering to shareholders, that are trying to just, sell a product, make a widget, offer some services. And when we have worked with those, I think without fail, it's not often for a lack of like a small business or startup. It's not for lack of um, interest in something like sustainability. Sometimes it's just knowledge or know-how still to this day. And so an example is there's kind of this dumb phone movement and, small tech companies trying to make, sort of the anti-smartphone to help with our addiction and to just make them more purposeful. A founder of a new little small smart or, dumb phone is in the impactful community, and he and I were chatting about sustainability. He's like, I want to be a sustainability phone manufacturer. He's like, I'm an engineer. So I'm building the phone and the software that goes with it. Still need the guidance, the institutional knowledge to help me. And that's where I do think the merger of, and the intersection of the private sector, public sector research and development, innovation is super helpful because you can take something that's rooted in science and technology or the latest research and help businesses apply it and implement it and help them apply it, across the board. So, I think when the private sector gets a bad rap, I get it. I think it is a lot rooted in consumerism and capitalism. But at the same time, there still are so many small businesses that are trying to do good, that are your local shop owner, that have a real opportunity to change and continue to do business better. right? As we learn more about how things are made, the impacts on the environment, and so forth. The thing with the big, the Monsantos of the world is a former boss of mine. She had a really good take on, she worked with, all the Fortune 500s of the world, basically. She said, there's a couple different routes. You can attack them and go head on like a Greenpeace, and that has its role. Extinction Rebellion, like really fighting these corporations head on, and through advocacy. And you can infiltrate, which is the Trojan horse example. And there are roles for all those to be played, right? I think it doesn't seem like, I think the climate sustainability movement, we talk about all these new systems, we talk about getting out of capitalism, but like, who goes first? How do you start that? Who at a system level? You see little incremental changes, but it doesn't seem like we're getting off the capitalism consumer train anytime soon. And so if that train is moving, then we have to steer it. We have to kind of keep trying to fight that energy to steer it in a certain direction. The analogy is, a person riding an elephant. Elephant is the emotion, person's the rational brain. You can steer the elephant for only so long before the elephant is going to go where it wants to go. And so you see that as still the play to, from a branding marketing perspective, to sex appeal, to consumer goods, to growth in GDP, and still to trying to bring the elephant over here so that it's not so hard for those steering it, if that analogy makes any sense. So I think that's a way of saying, long way of saying, yes, there are corporations who ideally should not exist, but don't seem like they're going to go away anytime soon. So while we work to build the new systems, the new technologies, and the implementation to replace them, like oil companies, then also you have to try to work within at the same time. I think there is still a role for all aspects of that competition, new technology, and working within. Sometimes I'm not the biggest fan of when we, in the environmental climate movement, identify a bad guy like the oil companies, because at the same level, like the oil companies are comprised of people. So we are the bad guy in some sense. So we need to kind of understand the interconnectivity of all of these things and hit them from all different angles too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think also, you mentioned the perverse incentives, the dead whale's worth more than a live whale. And then there's also like first mover advantage. If you don't take the opportunity to do something that makes it bigger, faster, cheaper than someone else will. So we're in this interesting time of crisis. And when trust is probably at all-time low, how are you getting people to collaborate when you said so much of your work is trust-based, when you're passing the apple in your Trojan horse to make sure everyone eats, and doing the deep kind of transformative work while also building the solidarity, this trust, in order to support this broader vision of flourishing and impact and a new togetherness, essentially. So I wonder if you could speak towards what trust really means, like on the ground when you're getting your hands dirty or painting or whatever you're doing with these corporations.
Yeah, there, it's really good questions, Karen. I think there's a sense of COVID, kind of the pandemic, sort of was maybe a trial run in a lot of ways on many aspects. Um, I think one we saw particularly in the impactful working with freelancers or creatives, solopreneurs, small business owners in the pandemic was there was immediately a feast or famine mindset. Is my business going to survive? So though people were very willing to collaborate because they didn't know what was going to survive. So, you maybe have small businesses that had two or three, consultants or sustainability consultants, and they had 5 clients and they lost 2 of them in the pandemic. So you're talking about, instances of 50% revenue, 75% revenue. Some folks, one client is their entire business just gone, or potential to be gone, or fears that it could be gone. So in those environments, I think and we're kind of in certain aspects of that politically and economically right now, is all the more reason to collaborate out of this. We need to. We almost have no choice. It's kind of feast or famine. So you do have that element of tapping into that, like, you don't have to go with this alone. I understand you just lost a bunch of clients. Let's be resourceful. Let's connect the dots. And anytime without fail in our community, we've slowed down, and same with businesses, said, what do you feel you really need? What feels heaviest right now? What's causing the most anxiety? What's keeping you up at night? You can usually find an opportunity to collaborate or to partner or to very least help. And then you can be creative with it as well, no matter what sector or space you're in. And I think this is maybe, helpful for some early in their career is we offered, I think in the pandemic, we offered free, impactful brainstorm sessions. And we just brought 10 of our members together and we put it out, all of us put it out on social media and said, hey, if your business is struggling in the pandemic, we'll do this session. We'll bring 10 of us. We have all these different skills and services. We'll come sort of attack your problem from different angles. And we had a lot of people sign up. We did maybe 5 or 6 of them. And then we're like, okay, we need to be charging for our time, talking about business models. But it was like, we were able to problem solve for these businesses. And I think what that also shows is you can lead by example. And again, I think we're in this time of, everything on the news is either the most amazing thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. And there are obviously some really horrific things going on, but you can lead through your work, through your example to show people how to slow down, how to find time to collaborate, and how to focus on doing important work and making sure that either a business, an institution, or an individual's needs are being met. And so I think when you create the space to do that, people still are open to collaboration and are more willing to do so, and also to then sort of establish trust. At the same time, I think it's also another aspect is we're always all learning and evolving. And so I think that applies to both technical skills and softer skills. I think there's such a propensity right now for technical skills. Sometimes we maybe forget the softer skills, just as terms of, sales or marketing or communication. And that feeds how to build trust and how to build relationships. For example, we have a lot of designers in the impactful, and for no fault of them, they're just not that versed or experienced in making something like a referral. And so we said, oh, okay, we just need to teach some of those softer skills about making a referral or what to say to a client or how to engage them, or if they introduced Zach, what to say. So, and it was like, oh, okay, it was just a matter of getting some experience doing some of those softer aspects that I think often we take for granted, or we forget that based on experience, based on knowledge, based on expertise, we don't all have those skill sets or experiences doing it.
No, I think that's really important. In looking at some of the World Economic Forum's forecasting for future job skills, a lot of them are the softer skills because our new genie is out of the bottle with AI. And so one of the things that I try to encourage students and people that I'm working with to consider is like, what can you do that a machine can't? And we have such different capacities for things, and I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. But at the core of what you're speaking to is, trust. We're talking about togetherness and actually doing impactful work, and having to invest in the trust process is so imperative, and often not financially. It's not considered one of the main KPIs as trust building. Like, how do we measure that?
Yeah. And I think, I would just add to that too, is there's going to be some failures. In starting the impactful, I got all these questions. Well, who's your ideal customer, and how is this going to work? I was like, I don't know, but let's go find out, right? And so, okay, what do you mean you don't know who your ideal customer is? Well, I was like, I don't know. We're just started out. You want me to do some research and pretend that we're going to work these things? Let's go talk to them. Let's go see who's interested in this, who needs help. Same with the members, early on, they're like, okay, so this is a group and you collaborate, but yet I'm still my own thing. Yeah. Okay. And so you still establish trust in various capacities gradually, but also I think through challenges. If you go through something challenging, then you can also, you come out the other side with trust, right? That Okay, well, you know, we have projects where maybe the client was unresponsive or didn't go a certain way, we had to cut it or we lost money, and how you respond as this ecosystem, as this group also establishes and shows trust where, how you get through difficult times together as well. Not just when you land the $1 million project, did you share it equally? But what about what happens when, that client stiffed you and you didn't get any money? How do you, as this nebulous, this ecosystem, react in difficult times? And I think obviously everything that is going on, businesses, organizations have to get through these difficult times, and that's a big way to establish trust as well. And one last thing I thought of on that note too is I think you see a lot in the social impact climate space, people who have really kind of identified, and also maybe in part of this in the freelancer, solopreneur, consultant spaces, identified some criteria based on their interests, based on their impact, kind of hearts, who and what they do and don't want to work with. And I think this is also a strong way to navigate the private sector. See, a lot of folks say, no, I don't work with that type of organization. I don't work with tobacco. Give yourself some of your own principles, guidelines to help essentially create some guardrails for yourself to keep you moving in areas of impact. Of course, if you're a small team, small business, you need sources of income and revenue. But I've seen a lot of folks in our space say, I've really tried to work with this type of organization because I believe in what they do. I believe in how they do it, or I'm really passionate about their industry. And that's another way to establish trust and to establish partnerships, is saying, I have a pretty good sense of how and where I like to operate. So if I can stay in that lane, great. Keep me part of this project, or let's keep, adding some services on.
No, I think that's really important. For the people who are listening who are like, "Oh, Zach, this sounds great, but like, really, how does it work? Like, it sounds like a unicorn, but let's make it, real." For the people who aren't yet full believers that this is possible to do impactful work and support each other and contribute
In
positively
the private sector.
in the
Yeah.
private sector, well, and your other clients, but we'll just pick on the client or on the private sector because they're kind of easy to pick on, especially right now. Can you give us some examples of like some positive transformations that you've witnessed and some impacts for the people who want to see like a quantifiable difference, or people
Sure.
who are looking for like the meat in the sandwich before they bite into this model?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your earlier point, how it all works, it's all an MLM, multi-level marketing. It's all just a Ponzi scheme. So happy to go into that detail. What is that? It's like we have all these people with garages full of makeup, and that's how it
Tupperware.
all works.
I'll buy your
Yeah,
Tupperware. Perfect.
environment everywhere. I grew up in Dallas, which is the home of Mary Kay, which may be one of the biggest MLMs in the history of MLMs. Anyways, we digress. Some positive transformations. One that I think often actually gets overlooked, and we've done a lot of work with, is organizations doing good work that just need help amplifying it. The number of nonprofits, NGOs, institutions whose website stinks or website is more work than it should be. These are we redid. There's an amazing, how do they frame it? Regenerative ocean farming nonprofit off the coast of Connecticut called Greenwave, and they open source plans to make for farmers, for basically fishermen, to create kelp and seaweed farms that are self-sustaining. And they open source the designs and the plans, so they're using technology. They're doing amazing work. Kelp, seaweed are huge carbon sinks, and their website was terrible and their branding was terrible. And so they just needed some help telling what they do better. They were getting all this amazing press and coverage. And then you kind of looked at them and you're like, wah, wah. And so sometimes those doing the good work just need boosts from various aspects. And I take zero credit for this, but we redid their branding, their logos, the templates, made it much easier for them to tell their story in a consistent design aesthetic. And then they won $1 million prize. It has nothing to do with the brand, but we like to pretend that it has to do with our branding. So that's an example, a space of whether it's for-profit, startup, NGO, Oftentimes these may be technical founders, engineering founders. They're offering a solution, a scientific breakthrough. They're doing research, and they need some of that complementary help or services to bolster. As far as other for profits that I think we've seen transformation, I think one interesting one was we had a kind of like an urban development 3D printing startup that did a entirely voluntary climate sustainability and DEI 4-day intensive workshop with their board of directors. They basically forced their board of directors to come. They said, we as a team find this stuff important. You need to be better educated on it. And we help facilitate and train and do the workshops on a whole host of topics. And I thought that was kind of neat from the standpoint of kind of flipping the script and saying, okay, you're our board. We at its core, we make money and we raise money, but these are our core values, and we need to make sure you as a board who kind of skewed a little bit older are like versed in this and are up to date and have something tangible and rooted. So that was an example of maybe the team leading in a situation that you don't often see. So those are two small examples that come to mind.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're quickly running out of time, but the last question, I'll leave it pretty open-ended, but what gives you, I don't want to say hope, because I think that word's being weaponized a lot right now, but what gets you out of bed to lace your boots up and keep going with the impactful work? And you can't say friends or family or anything, that everyone else does. So I'll just take the easy ones out. Um, and I'm thinking to frame this within the context of the younger listeners or the people who are just starting their climate journey or the people who are burnt out on their climate journey. Just a little oomph for the people who need it right now.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think what helps me going is my family. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Um, is this quote that maybe you and I talked about previously was, it doesn't matter if it turns out we're hospice worker or midwives, you still do the work. And I think that was really transformational, right? And just, if you're a midwife, you're bringing new life into the world. It's the beginning of the journey. And you have so many questions of unknowns of how this is going to shape out, what's in store, but you do the work. If you're a hospice worker, you're working on the end of life and you're helping someone transition into kind of this unknown time that everybody has sort of different beliefs and thoughts on what happens, and you don't know. And so I think that's really poignant right now in the climate space because there is so much discussion of, is it the end of the world? Is there anything out there? Is AI gonna kill us all? It's like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good answer, but at its core, I'm not sure it matters. And so I think that's somewhat freeing. Your point about hope is I do remain, somewhat optimistic, but I think doing the work because it's important, because we know it's better than not, is really the driving force. And to say, I don't know. I don't know if this is the end, but we have to do this work. We have to make things better. We have to try to get within the limits of this planet's capabilities and hope for the best in the journey going there. So I found that comforting in terms of removing the why sort of from the work and just doing it. and sometimes that's been freeing for me, myself, and some of my own existential dread.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate your time, your expertise, and how you show up to this really challenging work with a sense of humor uh, and coming at it from also a place of not knowing and being able to admit that you don't know. I think it's very refreshing, and I'm sure everyone listening will agree. It's been wonderful to have you on behalf of the Environmental Studies Association of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us at Congress 2025. We need more voices like yours, and I look forward to redefining togetherness. Yeah, in our next conversations.
Thank you, Kiera, so much. This was a pleasure and really enjoyed the conversation. And thank you for all that you do as well.
Thank you. I'll see you soon. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.